Let's extend our progressions, shall we? Okay, so you wrote this and it sounds great. But at some point, maybe you think, I don't know, you could maybe do a little more with it. It's fine, I suppose. But what if we added more chords? Can we do that? Is that illegal? I think so. So I want to talk about extending our progressions. And I'm starting with a bit of a contrived example. This is a 2-chord progression. We're in the key of C major. And we're using the C chord, which is the 1 chord, and the G chord, which is the 5 chord. What that means is, in the key of C, the note C is the first note, so we call that the first scale degree, and this is the chord built off of that note, and then G is the 5th note of that scale, etc., etc., etc. If that's something you don't understand at this point, you may want to not watch this. But if you do get that, please continue. So, I want to make this a bit longer and more interesting. Why don't I just copy it? Why don't I just make it, 8 measures long, and then I'll just, copy these chords, right? You can also just select something and hit duplicate, and that will do the same thing. So now I got an 8-measure chord progression. Check it out. Or do I? I don't know, this seems kind of like what I just listened to. Things keep repeating. Well, 8 measures of a clip does not make 8 measures of a chord progression. This chord progression and all chord progressions are defined in terms of length by repetition, right? So this chord progression is these 2 chords, and then it repeats itself, and it just keeps doing that, right? Here's the first repetition, the second repetition, and the third repetition. So it's actually a 2-chord progression repeated 4 times in total, right? Or it's played once and then repeated 3 times, however you want to look at it. It's not 4-chord, it's not an extended progression. It's not changing and becoming different all the way through from measure 1 to measure 8. So what we want to try to do is, do that, right? We want to make our progression more interesting from the beginning to the end. Let's go one step at a time, shall we? I'll get rid of this. So I'm going to copy this chord progression again. And the first thing you might think is, I don't know, what if I kind of change the chords up a little bit here and there? That can work. Let's check it out. What I'm going to do is, as an example, again, this is contrived because I thought of it ahead of time, but what I'm going to do is copy it, and then I'm going to take this last chord, and rather than make it a G chord, I'm going to make it an F chord by moving it down 2 steps. So this is now going to be 1, 5, 1, 4. Check it out. So much more interesting, right? So is that a 4-chord progression? Well, one thing we have to understand is progressions, again, are defined by repetition. So when we played the 1 chord here and then we played the 1 chord here, it sounds like we're kind of repeating ourselves, right? Now, I think you could make an argument that this is a 4-chord progression in the sense that things change over 4 measures, but some may argue that it's actually a 2-chord progression with a variation. Right, so we do 1, 5, then we repeat that, but instead of playing 1, 5, we play 1, 4. So one person might say this is chord progression 1, and this is 1B, rather than saying this is an entire brand new thing. To really do that, what we kind of need to do is make sure that every chord is doing something different, new, unexpected, that's not feeling like it's repeating itself. And that feeling like is important. We'll come back to that later. So I'm going to duplicate this. What I'm going to do is use a concept called diatonic substitution. What that means is, in any particular key signature, I can take a chord like this, and I can replace it with any chord that's a third away, and it will be similar but different. The reason why this works is because 2 out of 3 notes will be different, and that's great. So what I'm doing is I'm going to take this note C, I'm going to move it down to A, right? So in doing that, I'm also going to take the entire chord and move it down to A as well. And I know in my head already that in the key of C major, an A chord is minor, so I can't have a C sharp in it. It would have to be a C natural. So what I've done is I've taken the C major chord, that was in measure 3, and I've changed it into an A minor chord. But those two chords still have two notes in common. They have the C and the E are common to both chords. So it's a very easy replacement. And this chord progression is now going to be 1, 5, 6, 4. And it's going to sound a bit like this. Now that may sound familiar to you because, well, it's probably the most popular chord progression in modern pop music history over the last, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years. Give or take. I haven't really done a comprehensive study of that, but it's all over the place. And it's probably a good progression to start with. But what we're noticing here is we started out with a 2-chord progression that just repeated itself. Then we added a bit of a variation to that 2-chord progression, which made it more interesting, but it wasn't quite really a 4-chord progression in the way that this is, because every chord is different, every chord is new, every chord is changing how we feel about the music. The juxtaposition from one chord to the next creates a new feeling in us. Like it's a really solid 4-chord progression, right? So why don't we just repeat that? I'm going to take all this now and I'm going to hit duplicate. It makes it 8 measures in length. Wow, check that out. So now I've got an 8, whoops, I gotta unselect those. So now I've got an 8 measure chord progression, right? Well, that just sounds like it's repeating, just 4 measures rather than 2. And I hope you're noticing that, right? Like in our minds, we go, oh, wait, this is the same thing I just heard, right? It kind of triggers something in our head to say that this is a repetition. Now, I want to make a very important point here. That is not a bad thing. In fact, you could write an entire song using just one 4-chord progression and it would be just fine. In fact, it's been done many, many times. It will be done many, many times in the future. Don't even trip. It's perfectly normal. I wouldn't necessarily recommend writing an entire song on just a 2-chord progression. Has kind of been done in the past. It's just not necessarily all that interesting, especially when a couple more chords just add so much dimension to what you're doing. But what we're trying to do here is to really extend this out. We really want to make it feel like from the very beginning to the very end of these 8 measures, new things are constantly happening. So, how do we do that? Well, we want to try to make sure that we don't have any repetitions, that we're sort of making it brand new and fresh all the way through. But we're going to run into a problem here because, well, every scale only has 7 chords in it. Asterisk, there are certain scales that might have more or less, but generally speaking, the scales that we're working with, heptatonic scales, 7-note scales, major and minor scales, modes, whatever you're rolling with, are going to only have 7 chords because they only have 7 notes. You can only have as many chords as you have notes in a scale. So if the goal is to make it new and fresh all the way through for 8 measures, but we only have 7 chords, well, we have to think of something to do to make that work. And that means we're going to have to repeat ourselves. But we don't want to repeat ourselves, you know? Okay, so here's the thing. Repetition is not bad if we're careful about it. And the big thing we want to try to avoid to make something seem as if it is not repeating itself is to repeat the same thing in the same position. And what I mean by that is, think about 8 measures in length. Well, let's say we cut it in half, right? So that means the first 4 chords is the first half of that 8 measure progression. And the second 4 chords is the second half, because if we cut the thing in half, that halfway point is between measures 4 and 5. What we want to try to avoid, first and foremost, to make it seem like it's evolving over time, is to make sure that this chord and this chord are not the same thing. And that also applies to all the other ones, so measures 2 and 6, measures 3 and 7, and measures 4 and 8 currently are the same chords, and that's why this sounds so much like it's repeating itself, because it literally is. Everything that's happening in measures 1 through 4 repeats itself in measures 5 through 8, right? So we want to try to avoid that. Now, there's a lot of things we could do, I suppose, to do that, but we want to try to do as little work as possible as well. We only have 7 chords to choose from, so we're going to have to repeat something. So there's a few little tricks and tips and techniques and things that we can do to apply to this chord progression to make that work. One of the first ones is maybe we use what we already have and kind of shift things around a bit so as to avoid repetition in the same place. Now, I picked this example for a particular reason so I can show them to you. Mileage may vary on the chord progression you're creating, but these techniques are really, really useful, and I recommend you at least explore them in your composition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this chord, chord 1, and I'm going to delete it. But I'm going to take this chord in measure 6, and I'm going to move it over, and then I'm going to paste the chord that I had there before in measure 5 into measure 6. So what I've effectively done is swapped positions between this chord and that chord. And what that has done is it's changed which chords are in which position in the second half, thus avoiding repeating the same chords in the same position. Now I am repeating the same chords. I've got 1 and 5 here, but I've changed it to 5, 1. Let's listen to what that sounds like. It sounds a little bit more interesting, maybe. What we've done is we've taken away that sense of clear repetition. So now our brain is not like, oh, this is the thing that we just heard again. Our brain is going, oh, this is new relative to where we came from a measure or two ago. And this also brings up another interesting point, which is that of our auditory memory, right? When we're listening to a chord progression or we're listening to any music, we're listening to it only at that moment in time that it's playing, right? We're not listening to parts of the song in the past, and we're not listening to parts of the song in the future. And the things that happened in the past kind of fade away over time. So even though we did hear these 2 chords, at the beginning of the progression, because we've changed the order, we've sort of reimagined how they can be perceived. And because they happened so long ago in our auditory memory, it's almost like they never existed. So we're sort of tapping into some interesting phenomena of the human mind to try to make this chord progression seem like it's not doing the same thing, even though it kind of is, right? We're repeating 2 chords, literally. But that's okay, because we're changing the order, thus shifting the perceptual impact that this chord progression has on the human mind. So, super fun. Let's continue with that. Now, we could do that here too. And it might work. I'm not sure. Maybe it would work. Well, I don't think it would sound super good. But I want to do something completely different. In fact, I want to get rid of these chords entirely. In fact, I'm going to delete this guy right here. You know what? I'll leave it for now. I actually want to start at the end because I want to do something different here. And I want to sort of harken back to the idea of tonality and kind of show you a really interesting thing about that whole auditory memory thing. I'm going to change this chord from an F major chord, which is the 4 chord, to a G major chord, which is the 5 chord. And it turns out we've used that chord before, here and here. Now that seems like a lot of repetition, yeah? Like maybe that's not going to be good? Well, before I play it, I'm actually going to do one more thing. I'm going to take this chord and turn it into something that we haven't heard before. So I'm going to try to introduce something brand new. And I'm sort of thinking backwards here. I'm using the root motion of a 4th to kind of decide what I'm going to do. This chord, G major, is a 4th away from C major. So what I'm going to do is pick a chord here that's a 4th away from G major. Now you may be thinking, that's not a 4th, that's a 5th. Well, if you go up, it's a 5th. If I went down, it would be a 4th. I'm just going up here for the sake of, sonic clarity. I will invert it later to kind of show you what it sounds like when it's smoothed out. But these chords are now a 4th apart. I'm essentially moving backwards. I know what my target is. My target's 1, so I'm moving backwards from that a 4th away, and then I'm moving backwards from that a 4th away, creating a sense where we have a 2-5 progression. It's what we kind of consider a turnaround or a cadence or the end of our phrase. So now if I play this whole progression, check out how it really never feels like it repeats itself, at least not to our minds. Now, are chords repeating? Yes. Are they repeating in a way that makes it seem like the entire progression is repeating? No. right? What we've done is, in effect, we have changed what happens in the first and second half at any particular point in time so as not to create a discernible repetition of the same pattern, right? This chord and this chord are different. This chord and this chord are different. This chord and this chord are different. And this chord and this chord are different. And you may be wondering, well, you use G 3 times? Is that okay? Well, going back to that idea of auditory memory, each of those repetitions, first of all, is not the same in the first and the second half, right? Like measure 2, measure 5, measure 8. But secondly, they're all spaced by at least 2 chords or more. In this case, they're all spaced 2 chords apart and 2 measures apart. So by the time we get back to the 5 chord again, we kind of forgot that we heard it before. Now, what we might not want to do is do something like this, where we move, let's say the 5 chord. Let's do this. I'll delete it, and I'll move this 4 over here, and I'll put the 5 here. When we do this, we're kind of putting the 5 chord too close to itself. I'm not going to say this will never work, but it often feels like a regression. It feels like we're kind of taking a step forward and then we're taking a step back to where we came from. But 2 or more chords is kind of like that magic number to make us forget that we heard it before. In fact, I'll play this first section so you can hear it. Now, it's not the worst thing in the world. No one's going to, get too mad at you for that. But we can do better than that. Doing this, spacing them out by 2 or more chords, really makes it much harder for the mind to remember that they had experienced it before. And this is only a chord progression. Like, we're not hearing a melody or drums or any interesting sounds or anything on top of that. All of that's going to take away from our perception of remembering these chords even more. So it's going to be even less likely that anyone would go, oh, wait, I heard that like 2 chords ago. That's nonsense. Not at all. That's not a thing. And people exploit this concept all the time. So if we really think about this, utilizing those concepts of not essentially not creating the same thing in the same place and keeping all of our repetitions spaced out as much as possible, we have created a chord progression that basically sounds like it's never repeating itself for an entire 8 measures, because it really isn't. There are individual repetitions of chords, but the entire pattern itself over, 2, 3 measures or more is not repeating in any discernible way that our human mind can pick up as a repeated pattern. So that chord progression, if we write out all the Roman numerals, 1, 5, 6, 4, 5, 1, and then 2, and then 5, right? So that is an 8 chord progression. The 5 chord is repeated, the 1 chord is repeated twice. And then over here, then the 5 chord is repeated thrice. I like saying that word, it's fun. But it never seems as if it gets boring or in the way or blah, blah, blah. Like it works really, really well. Now I want to do something really quick, just because I promised I would. I'm going to invert these chords so that the motion from one chord to the next is even smoother. Check this out. And a little bonus Easter egg for you. I noticed, I've got a 2-5. What if I grabbed a fancy secondary harmony concept and I applied it to this chord progression, targeting my last chord? It's actually pretty easy to do because these are already a 4th apart. The 5th of a G chord is D. So all I need to do to make this, check this out, a 5-7 of 5, is go to this chord and change a few notes. I'm going to leave the root and the bass. Now I'm going to make it a major triad by taking the minor 3rd and making it major by making the F sharp, and I'm going to move the D down to C. That is the 7th. I don't need the root in this voicing because I've got the root down here. That's enough. This is what we call a rootless voicing. It's got the 3, the 5, and the 7. That's a minor 7 and a major 3rd and a perfect 5th. That creates a dominant 7th chord. Check this out. Pretty swanky. If you think it sounds like a barbershop quartet, kind of does. 5 of 5 to 5 is a very kind of thing from that era. I think I missed an inversion, actually. I can do this as well. So in closing, we can make extended chord progressions if we want to, just by playing with the position of chords, making sure that we don't create the perception of a repeated chord progression. We don't hear the same chords doing the same thing over and over and over again, but we can repeat individual chords. And in fact, we only used 5, I believe, out of the 7 chords that are possible in the key of C major. We didn't even use all 7 chords, but it still sounds like we made something that keeps changing over time. Now, I did borrow a chord here, but even going back to this example, let me fix that inversion. Again, it's not a bad thing that I didn't fully invert it. It's just fine. Just sort of showing it by example so you really can see it. But yeah, we're able to create something that's much more interesting to listen to, potentially. Now, again, going back to the overall, important point of this whole conversation is, do you have to do this? Is this necessary? Well, of course not. You could write a song using only a 2-chord progression. It's a bit harder to do that. I don't necessarily recommend it all the time. What you see in most popular modern music is people are generally using 4-chord progressions, maybe 1 to 3 of those in a song. Depends on what you want. But something like this can be really interesting if you're kind of looking to make something a little bit longer, a little bit more interesting, a little more change over time. A really good use case actually for this, in my opinion, is bridges, right? If you're writing a song and the song's getting kind of bored, you keep kind of disinterested after you've had a couple verses and choruses, introducing a really fresh, new, different bridge to the music really kind of, opens the windows, lets in the fresh air. It just kind of makes the song a bit more interesting. And the more you can sort of make that chord progression evolve, the more energy and momentum you can add to that piece of music. So I would say something like a bridge is a really good spot for some idea like this, and or the entire song. It's up to you. This is definitely additive. This is not necessary. You don't have to do this, but it can be really, really nice. Anyway, if you have any thoughts or questions, let me know. Peace.